The elk quarter hung in the smokehouse had been there since late October, and now in mid-April it looked as fresh as the day it was hung. Thomas Merrick cut a thin slice with his knife, examined the deep amber color, smelled the rich wood smoke aroma, and ate it without hesitation. No mold, no spoilage, no rancid taste, just perfectly preserved meat after 6 months in a small log structure he had built with his own hands. What happened in the 2 years leading up to that moment would revolutionize how mountain men survived winters in the Rockies, and the techniques Thomas discovered would be whispered about at rendezvous gatherings for the next 3 decades. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Thomas Merrick stood in front of his meat cache on a frozen January morning in 1835, staring at what should have been his survival through the rest of winter. Instead, he was looking at rot. The deer haunch he had carefully salted and hung in October now showed green-black mold creeping across its surface. The elk quarters he had dried with such confidence in November had turned slimy to the touch, the flesh beneath the surface spoiled beyond salvation. Even the smaller cuts smelled wrong when he brought them close to his face. Thomas stood there for a long time, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, trying to calculate how badly he had just failed himself. He had perhaps 2 weeks of edible meat remaining, and winter in the Montana Rockies typically lasted until late April. Thomas Merrick had been trapping in the Rocky Mountains for 8 years. He was 31 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, where he had worked as an apprentice butcher before heading west in 1827. That background had given him confidence in meat preservation. He understood salting, drying, and cold storage because he had learned those techniques from a professional butcher. The problem was that town butchering and wilderness preservation operated under completely different conditions. In Pennsylvania, his mentor had worked in a dedicated smokehouse with controlled conditions. In the mountains, Thomas was working alone with whatever materials he could gather, with meat that needed to last for months rather than days. Thomas cut away the spoiled sections, salvaging what he could. The waste was staggering. He estimated he was throwing away more than 2/3 of what he had preserved. The irony was bitter. He had spent weeks in the autumn hunting and processing this meat. The elk had nearly killed him during the hunt when it charged after his first shot missed its vital organs. Now most of that elk was fit only for scavengers. Thomas had used the preservation methods that were common knowledge among mountain men. Salt was the primary preservative, expensive but essential, purchased at trading posts. He had rubbed salt thoroughly into every surface. For drying, he had hung meat in his cabin's rafters where fire heat would slowly dehydrate it. The results spoke for themselves. Thomas spent the rest of that January day hunting. He found deer tracks by mid-afternoon and followed them into dense pine trees. The deer was a young doe. Thomas shot her cleanly, feeling no satisfaction, only relief. He field-dressed the carcass and hauled it back before dark. It took him 3 hours, and by arrival he was exhausted. This was what the next 3 months would look like. That night, Thomas sat by his fire eating fresh venison. He had followed accepted methods for meat preservation, techniques that other trappers claimed to use successfully. But clearly, something was different. The winter of 1835 would not kill Thomas Merrick, but it would change him. Somewhere in the exhaustion of those months, a question took root and would not let go. If the traditional methods were this unreliable, what would reliable preservation actually require? February in the Montana Rockies was the cruelest month. The initial excitement of deep winter snow had faded, replaced by grinding cold that penetrated every layer of clothing and turned simple tasks into exhausting ordeals. Thomas Merrick was living day to day now, hunting every other morning just to maintain enough fresh meat to keep himself functional. His trap lines were suffering from neglect, which meant his income for the spring rendezvous was evaporating while he focused entirely on not starving. He had lost weight, probably 15 pounds from his already lean frame, and he could feel the difference in his strength and endurance. The mathematics of his situation were unforgiving. Thomas needed approximately 2 pounds of meat per day to maintain his body weight while doing the physical labor required for winter survival. Hunting every other day meant he needed to bring back 4 pounds minimum each trip, but accounting for waste and bone, that meant killing something substantial every 48 hours. Deer were scarce, wary, and increasingly difficult to find as winter progressed. Thomas was spending entire days searching for game, burning calories he could barely afford to lose, gambling that he would find something before exhaustion forced him back empty-handed. He had 3 close calls in February alone where he returned with nothing and had to ration his remaining meat down to portions that left him hungry and weak. The psychological toll was worse than the physical deprivation. Thomas had always prided himself on his competence, his ability to thrive in an environment that killed careless men regularly. Now he was reduced to constant anxiety about his next meal, second-guessing every decision, wondering if he should abandon his trap lines entirely and move to lower elevation where game might be more plentiful. He thought constantly about the spoiled meat he had thrown away in January. Each bite of fresh venison reminded him that he could be eating from a secure stockpile instead of gambling his survival on daily hunts. By late February, Thomas had lost enough weight that his pants required a new notch in his belt and his ribs were visible when he washed. He avoided looking at his reflection in the small mirror he kept for shaving. The face looking back at him was gaunt, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that had developed a feverish intensity. He recognized the signs of malnutrition from having seen them in other trappers who had miscalculated their food supplies. The irony was that he was surrounded by potential food, but in deep winter, finding and killing that food required energy he was running out of. Thomas understood he was approaching a critical threshold. He needed spring to arrive soon, or he needed to make a significant change in his strategy. On the last day of February, he made a decision that probably saved his life. He would stop trying to maintain his trap lines and focus exclusively on building up his meat supply before he became too weak to hunt effectively. The financial cost would be severe, but staying alive mattered more than profit. Spring arrived in late March with grudging slowness, and Thomas survived, but he carried those winter months like scars. He would never let this happen again. Spring arrived in late March with the grudging slowness typical of high-altitude Montana. Thomas Merrick had survived the winter, but barely, and he carried the psychological scars of those months like physical wounds. He had lost nearly 25 pounds, taken dangerous risks hunting in conditions that should have killed him, and learned that competence meant nothing when your fundamental methods were flawed. As snow melted and game returned to higher elevations, Thomas began eating regularly again and regaining his strength. But something had changed permanently in how he thought about survival. He could not go through another winter like the last one. That meant he needed to solve the meat preservation problem completely, and he needed to solve it before autumn arrived. Thomas spent May and June traveling between trapping camps, trading posts, and rendezvous sites, asking questions. He talked to French-Canadian voyageurs who had worked the Northern Territories for decades. He spoke with American trappers who claimed to have perfected meat preservation. He listened to traders who dealt with preserved meat as a commodity. He even sought out interactions with Shoshone and Crow tribesmen who had been preserving meat successfully for generations before white trappers arrived in their territory. The education was humbling and contradictory. Everyone had a method, and everyone claimed their method was superior. But the details varied wildly and often directly contradicted each other. The French-Canadian voyageurs emphasized smoking over extended periods, sometimes weeks, using specific hardwoods they claimed were essential. One grizzled voyageur named Baptiste told Thomas that green hickory was the only wood worth using, and that meat needed to hang in smoke for at least 30 days to be truly preserved. An American trapper from Kentucky insisted that salt curing was primary and smoking was merely for flavor, claiming he kept meat edible for 6 months with nothing but salt and cold storage. A Shoshone man Thomas met near a trading post on the Yellowstone River explained through broken English and hand gestures that his people dried meat in thin strips over low fires, creating something hard as leather that would last indefinitely if kept dry. Thomas began making mental notes, trying to identify common principles beneath the varying techniques. Everyone agreed that moisture was the enemy. Spoilage happened when meat stayed wet, allowing mold and rot to take hold. Everyone agreed that salt helped, though opinions varied on how much and how to apply it. Most people mentioned smoke as important, though again the details differed wildly. Temperature came up frequently but vaguely. Too hot and meat cooked instead of preserving. Too cold and the preservation process slowed or stopped. Thomas realized that successful preservation was not about following one person's recipe. It was about understanding the underlying principles and then applying them systematically in his specific conditions. Nobody could give him a simple answer because preservation depended on dozens of variables that changed with location, climate, and available materials. He would need to experiment, test, and refine his own method. The thought was daunting but also strangely exciting. Thomas had always been good at solving practical problems. Now he had a problem worth solving. Thomas spent late July and early August of 1835 building his first smokehouse. He chose a location 30 yards from his main cabin, near a small creek that provided water for mixing clay chinking. The design was simple, borrowed from descriptions he had gathered during his spring research. He constructed a rectangular structure approximately 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the peak. The walls were horizontal logs notched at corners, similar to cabin construction, but smaller in scale. He left gaps between some logs intentionally to allow smoke to circulate, though he was guessing at how much ventilation was optimal. The floor was packed earth, and in the center he dug a shallow pit for his fire. Thomas reasoned that keeping the fire inside the structure would maximize smoke exposure and minimize heat loss. He installed 2 levels of wooden racks made from green willow branches, one at shoulder height and another near the roof peak. The door was simple, made from split logs bound together with leather strips, designed to close tightly but not seal completely. The roof was bark and pine boughs angled to shed rain. The entire construction took him 6 days working, alone. In mid-August, he killed a mule deer and used it as his first test. He butchered the deer carefully, creating cuts similar to what he had seen described by the voyageurs. He salted the meat liberally and let it sit overnight to draw out moisture. The next morning, he hung the cuts in his new smokehouse, started a fire using cottonwood, and began the smoking process. The problems revealed themselves within hours. The fire pit on the ground created too much direct heat. The meat on the lower racks was cooking rather than smoking, the fat rendering out and dripping into the fire. Thomas tried reducing the fire size, but then smoke production dropped and the temperature fell too low to have any preservation effect. He experimented with fire placement, moving coals around the pit, trying to find a balance between heat and smoke. By the 3rd day, the meat on the lower rack was overcooked on the outside, but still raw inside. The meat on the upper rack looked better, but when he checked it after a week, mold was growing on several pieces. The humidity from the ground and the inconsistent temperature had created perfect conditions for spoilage. Thomas cut his losses after 10 days. Most of the test batch was ruined. A few pieces from the upper rack were salvageable, but they were not properly preserved, just partially smoked meat that would need to be eaten within days. The disappointment was crushing. He had invested significant time and effort into this structure, and it had failed. Thomas sat outside his failed smokehouse on a warm August evening, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He had built a structure without understanding the processes that structure needed to support. Smoke alone was not enough. Temperature control was critical, and he had none. Moisture was destroying his meat, despite the smoke. He needed to understand why preservation worked before he could build something that actually preserved. Thomas did not abandon his smokehouse. Instead, he began treating it as a laboratory for systematic experimentation. Throughout September and October of 1835, he tested variables methodically, changing one element at a time and observing results. He killed rabbits and smaller game for these experiments, creatures that required less investment than deer or elk, but still provided meaningful test subjects for preservation techniques. Each test taught him something, even when it failed, and slowly a coherent understanding began emerging from the chaos of contradictory advice he had gathered earlier. Temperature was the first breakthrough. Thomas discovered through painful trial that meat preservation required a narrow temperature range: too hot, above roughly 120 degrees, and meat cooked, too cold, below 70 degrees, and the smoking process became ineffective at preventing spoilage. The ideal range seemed to be between 80 and 100 degrees, warm enough to dry the meat gradually, while cool enough to avoid cooking. Maintaining that range with a ground-level fire pit was nearly impossible because fire temperature fluctuated wildly depending on wood type, fire size, and airflow. Thomas realized he needed to separate the fire source from the meat chamber. allowing smoke to cool slightly before reaching the hanging meat. Wood selection was the second critical discovery. Thomas tested cottonwood, willow, pine, juniper, and aspen, the woods most readily available in his territory. Each produced different results. Pine created harsh smoke that made meat taste bitter and did little to prevent spoilage. Cottonwood burned too hot and produced minimal smoke. Willow was better, creating mild smoke and moderate heat, but the preservation effect was inconsistent. Juniper produced the best results, creating aromatic smoke that seemed to actively discourage mold growth. The meat smoked over juniper stayed fresh noticeably longer than meat smoked over other woods. Thomas began stockpiling juniper specifically for smoking purposes. Moisture control emerged as the third essential element. Thomas noticed that meat hung during humid periods spoiled faster regardless of smoke exposure. He began monitoring weather patterns and learned to recognize conditions that favored preservation versus conditions that encouraged rot. Clear, dry days with low humidity were ideal for starting the smoking process. Foggy or rainy periods required either delaying preservation or compensating with longer smoking duration. He also discovered that pre-salting meat and allowing it to sit for 24 hours before smoking was essential. The salt drew moisture out of the meat tissue, creating a drier surface that smoke could penetrate more effectively. Hanging height became the fourth variable Thomas mastered. He discovered that different positions in the smokehouse created different temperature zones. Meat hung near the roof peak was too hot. Meat hung too low was too cool and collected condensation. The optimal zone was roughly 4 feet above the fire source, high enough to avoid direct heat, but low enough to receive consistent smoke. Thomas began arranging meat carefully by cut type, placing larger pieces in cooler zones and smaller pieces where temperature was slightly higher. By late October, Thomas had accumulated enough knowledge to attempt a complete redesign. Winter was approaching, and he had one chance to get this right. Thomas began construction of his second smokehouse in early November of 1836. Every element of this design incorporated lessons from his year of experimentation, and every decision was deliberate rather than guessed. He chose a location on slightly elevated ground to ensure drainage and prevent ground moisture from accumulating inside the structure. The site had good air circulation but was protected from prevailing winds that could make temperature control difficult. He spent 2 days just selecting and preparing the location before cutting a single log. The structure itself was smaller than his first attempt, only 5 feet wide by 6 feet deep, but taller at 9 feet to the roof peak. Thomas built the walls from carefully selected logs, each one straight and uniform in diameter, to create tight fits at the corners. He used traditional notching but added wooden pins driven through the corners to prevent any shifting or separation. Between each log, he packed a mixture of clay, dried grass, and animal hair that he had learned created superior chinking to plain mud. This mixture dried hard but remained slightly flexible, preventing cracks from forming as the wood settled. The critical innovation was the raised floor. Thomas constructed a platform of split logs 18 inches above the ground, supported by corner posts sunk deep into the earth. This elevation served multiple purposes. It prevented ground moisture from affecting the meat, improved air circulation underneath the structure, and most importantly, allowed him to build his fire pit beneath the raised floor rather than inside the meat chamber. Thomas dug a shallow pit directly under the center of the raised floor and lined it with flat stones to contain the fire and reflect heat upward. He cut a small opening in the raised floor directly above the fire pit, just large enough to allow smoke to rise into the meat chamber, but small enough to prevent excessive heat transfer. The smoke would rise through the floor opening, fill the chamber where meat hung, and exit through an adjustable vent hole Thomas built into the roof peak. By controlling the size of the roof vent, he could regulate how quickly smoke escaped, which in turn controlled the temperature and smoke density inside the chamber. A larger vent opening meant faster smoke circulation and lower temperature. A smaller opening meant slower circulation and higher temperature. Thomas could adjust conditions based on weather, meat type, and stage of the smoking process. Inside, in the chamber, Thomas installed 3 levels of hanging racks made from juniper branches, positioned at 3 feet, 5 feet, and 7 feet above the raised floor. This gave him distinct temperature zones. The lowest rack received the most heat and densest smoke. The middle rack was the optimal zone for most meat. The highest rack was coolest and best for longer-term storage of already smoked meat. The door was constructed from thick planks with leather hinges and a simple wooden latch that sealed tightly but could be opened easily for monitoring. Thomas stood back and examined his work after 12 days of construction. The smokehouse looked professional, almost elegant in its simplicity. Every element had a purpose, and every purpose was based on knowledge he had earned through failure. Now came the test that mattered. Could this design actually preserve meat for 6 months? Thomas killed a bull elk in late October of 1836, a massive animal that provided nearly 300 pounds of usable meat. This would be his comprehensive test of the new smokehouse design. He butchered the elk methodically, creating cuts of various sizes to test how different thicknesses responded to the smoking process. Large haunches, medium roasts, smaller steaks, and thin strips, each would hang in the smokehouse and either prove or disprove his method over the coming months. He salted every piece heavily, rubbing coarse salt into all surfaces, then let the meat sit in his cabin overnight while salt drew out moisture. The next morning, Thomas loaded the smokehouse carefully. Large cuts went on the middle rack where temperature was most stable. Medium pieces filled the lower rack where heat was slightly higher. The upper rack remained empty for now, reserved for meat that had already completed initial smoking. He started his fire using seasoned juniper wood, keeping the flame small and controlled. Smoke began rising through the floor opening within minutes, filling the padded chamber with fragrant white smoke. Thomas adjusted the roof vent until smoke flowed steadily, but not rapidly, creating the circulation pattern he wanted. The temperature inside the chamber stabilized around 90 degrees, exactly where he needed it. For the first week, Thomas monitored the smokehouse constantly. He checked temperature multiple times daily by simply placing his hand inside and gauging the heat. He adjusted the fire size and roof vent opening based on weather conditions. Cold nights required slightly larger fires. Warm afternoons required opening the vent wider to prevent overheating. He rotated meat pieces occasionally to ensure even smoke exposure. After 7 days, the meat had developed a dark mahogany color and firm texture. Thomas moved the large cuts to the upper rack and started a new batch of fresh meat on the middle rack. The process was working. By mid-November, Thomas had smoked his entire elk supply. The smokehouse was full, racks loaded with dark, aromatic meat that showed no signs of spoilage. He began the waiting period that would truly test his method. He cut small samples weekly to check for any deterioration. Through November and December, the meat remained perfect. January brought the coldest temperatures of winter, and still the meat showed no mold, no off smells, no degradation. February and March passed with the same results. Thomas was eating from his smoked supply regularly now, and every piece was as good as the day it finished smoking. April arrived, and Thomas approached his smokehouse with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. 6 months had passed since he had smoked the first cuts from that October elk. He cut a thick slice from one of the original haunches, the piece that had hung longest. The meat was firm, dry on the surface but not desiccated. The color was deep brown, almost black in places from the concentrated smoke. Thomas smelled it carefully, detecting only juniper smoke and the rich aroma of preserved meat. He ate the slice slowly, and it was perfect. Not fresh meat certainly, but completely preserved, safe, nutritious, and edible. Thomas had succeeded. His method worked absolutely. He had solved the problem that had nearly killed him 14 months earlier. Thomas attended the summer rendezvous of 1837 with quiet confidence. He brought smoked meat samples that had been preserved for 8 months, offering them to other trappers without explanation. Men tasted the meat, asked questions about his methods, and Thomas answered honestly. He had no reason to keep his techniques secret. The knowledge had saved his life, and he saw no benefit in hoarding it while other men struggled with the same problems he had faced. Word spread quickly through the gathering. Thomas Merrick had built a smokehouse that actually worked, and he was willing to explain how. The initial response was skepticism mixed with interest. Experienced trappers had seen many claimed innovations over the years, most of which failed when tested under real conditions. Thomas expected this and simply invited doubters to visit his camp and examine his smokehouse directly. A dozen men took him up on the offer over the following weeks. Thomas showed them every detail of his design, explained the reasoning behind each element, and answered questions patiently. Some visitors understood immediately why his method worked. Others remained skeptical but agreed to try building similar structures. A few dismissed the whole thing as too much effort for uncertain benefit. By autumn of 1837, Thomas knew of at least 5 other trappers who had built smokehouses based on his design. 2 of them built careful replicas, following his instructions precisely. 3 others modified the design, either because they lacked certain materials or because they thought they could improve on his method. The results that winter were mixed. The 2 trappers who followed Thomas's design exactly reported complete success. Their meat preserved beautifully, and they wrote messages through mutual acquaintances expressing gratitude and amazement. The 3 who had modified the design had partial success at best. One trapper had built his smokehouse on flat ground instead of elevated terrain and struggled with moisture problems. Another had used pine wood instead of juniper because pine was more abundant, and his meat developed an unpleasant bitter taste. The third had tried to save construction time by reducing the chinking quality, and his smokehouse lost heat so rapidly that maintaining proper temperature required burning through his wood supply at an unsustainable rate. When Thomas heard these reports, he felt frustration but also recognition. These men were making the same mistake he had made initially, assuming that the general concept was sufficient without understanding why specific details mattered. Thomas spent the summer of 1838 teaching more deliberately. When trappers asked about his smokehouse, he no longer just described what to build, but explained why each element was important. He emphasized that shortcuts usually meant failure, and that the extra effort during construction paid off enormously during winter. Some men listened carefully and built successful smokehouses. Others continued trying to find easier methods and continued experiencing mixed results. By 1839, the phrase Merrick Smokehouse was being used at rendezvous gatherings to describe the elevated, ventilated design that actually preserved meat reliably. Thomas never sought credit or tried to profit from his innovation, but his name became attached to it simply because he was known as the man who had solved the problem. Other trappers refined and adapted his basic design, creating regional variations that worked in different climates and elevations, but the fundamental principles remained consistent. By 1840, the techniques Thomas Merrick had developed were spreading beyond the trapper community into the broader frontier population. Settlers moving west into Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho territories encountered trappers using Merrick-style smokehouses and recognized the value immediately. Unlike transient trappers who might abandon a structure after one season, settlers were establishing permanent homesteads and needed reliable food preservation for their families. The investment of time and materials required to build a proper smokehouse made sense when that structure would serve a family for years or decades. Trading posts began stocking materials specifically for smokehouse construction. Iron hardware for hinges and latches, which Thomas had scavenged or improvised, became available for purchase. Clay suitable for chinking was sold by the barrel. Detailed instructions for construction appeared in frontier newspapers and guides written for immigrants heading west. The design evolved as it spread, incorporating regional materials and adapting to local conditions. In areas where juniper was scarce, builders discovered that hickory, apple, or cherry wood produced excellent results. In extremely cold climates, some builders added double-wall construction for better insulation. In areas with heavy rainfall, roof designs became more elaborate to ensure complete waterproofing. The United States Army took interest in the preservation methods around 1842. Frontier forts required reliable meat storage for their garrisons, and standard military supply chains were often inadequate in remote territories. Several fort commanders ordered the construction of large smokehouses based on the Merrick design, scaled up to handle the meat requirements of 50 to 100 soldiers. These military smokehouses proved so successful that the Army included detailed construction specifications in their frontier operations manuals. Officers trained in proper smokehouse design carried that knowledge to new postings across the expanding Western territories. Commercial meat operations began using similar techniques by the late 1840s. As towns grew in the Mountain West, professional butchers needed preservation methods that could handle large volumes of meat. The principles Thomas had discovered for personal survival scaled effectively to commercial operations. Urban smokehouses in Denver, Salt Lake City, and other frontier towns used elevated construction, separated fire chambers, and controlled ventilation to produce preserved meat that could be sold months after processing. The economic impact was significant, allowing seasonal hunting and butchering to support year-round meat supplies. Indigenous communities also adopted elements of the design. Tribes that had traditionally used simple drying methods saw advantages in the controlled smoking process, particularly for trading preserved meat to settlers and military posts. Some tribal groups built hybrid structures that combined traditional drying techniques with the temperature control and smoke circulation principles from Merrick-style smokehouses. The result was preserved meat that satisfied both traditional tastes and the practical requirement for extended storage. By 1850, variations of Thomas Merrick's smokehouse design existed throughout the Rocky Mountain region and beyond. The exact number was impossible to determine, but evidence suggests hundreds of structures based directly or indirectly on his original innovation. Most builders never knew Thomas's name or story. They simply learned the technique from someone who had learned it from someone else, the knowledge spreading organically because it solved a real problem effectively. Thomas himself had moved away from active trapping by this time, transitioning to a more settled life, but his legacy continued growing without his direct involvement. Thomas Merrick left the mountains in 1844 at the age of 40. The fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats toward silk. Thomas had saved money during his successful years and used it to purchase land in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana, where he established a small ranch. He married a widow named Sarah, who had come west with a wagon train and lost her husband to cholera. They had 2 children together and raised Sarah's daughter from her first marriage. Thomas became a quiet member of a growing frontier community, known as a competent rancher and occasional hunting guide, but rarely discussing his years as a mountain man. In 1856, Thomas encountered a young homesteader named William, building a smokehouse on adjacent property. Thomas watched for a few minutes before recognizing his own design in the elevated floor and separated fire chamber. He approached and introduced himself, asking where William had learned the technique. William explained that his father had built a similar smokehouse in Wyoming Territory 5 years earlier after learning the method from a trapper at a trading post. The young man had no idea he was talking to the person who had originally developed the design. Thomas felt a strange mixture of pride and insignificance. His innovation had become anonymous knowledge, passed along without attribution, which was exactly how useful ideas should spread. Thomas offered a few suggestions about roof ventilation based on the specific wind patterns in that location. William thanked him and incorporated the advice. The smokehouse worked beautifully that winter, and William told neighbors that an old rancher named Merrick had helped him with the design, never realizing the name had deeper significance. Thomas found satisfaction in this anonymous contribution. He had solved a problem, shared the solution freely, and watched it improve lives across an entire region. That was enough. Thomas died in 1868 at age 64, following a stroke that left him partially paralyzed for his final 3 months. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Stevensville, Montana. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death years, and the phrase, "beloved husband and father." Nothing mentioned his years in the mountains or the innovation that carried his name across the frontier. His family knew he had been a trapper but understood little about his specific accomplishments. To them, he was simply a good man who had built a stable life after a rough past. But across Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and beyond, smokehouses built on Thomas Merrick's principles continued functioning. Some were still original structures from the 1830s and 40s, weathered but solid, their elevated floors and ventilation systems as effective as the day they were built. Others were newer constructions, built by people who had learned the technique secondhand or thirdhand, the knowledge simplified and adapted, but still fundamentally sound. The phrase "built like a Merrick smokehouse" became frontier shorthand for construction that would last and function reliably. Thomas Merrick had started with a simple need to survive winter. He ended by changing how thousands of people preserved food across the American frontier. His innovation required no new technology, just careful observation, systematic experimentation, and willingness to share what he learned. That was legacy enough.